Okay.
I just hit go live.
Okay, we're live now, so we're waiting for you, Miles.
Awesome.
Come on back now. Herschel, are you there?
Yeah, I turned off his video.
Okay, we're not live yet, are we?
No, it's
Yeah, it says live on Facebook in the upper left corner. So do me a favor, warn me before
live. How exciting.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's great, man. I think, you know what? I think Gil would dig the birthday present.
Yeah.
You know, if Gil knew what Zoom was, he would dig his son's going on, you know, internationally to talk about his work and his life. I think he would probably really appreciate that you guys are doing it.
Yeah, keeping the spirit alive.
Yeah, and
right.
if you catch Anita in a cogent moment this week, maybe she'll dig what's going on too, you know.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Gil loved technology, so I mean.
So Gil was like Herbie, like he'd know how to use this shit, like Miles.
He would.
He
Okay.
loved his tape machines. So he had the tape machines were the technology of the day, and
The reel to reels, right?
but also cassette machines. He had them
Yeah.
all, you know,
Yeah.
Walkman, cassette
Yeah.
machines, all the stuff. He was so into it.
Okay, well, fellas, it's 7, so let's do what Herschel needs us to do. Where are we at, Herschel?
we're going. And welcome to Live Sessions with Live Jazz KC. This is Herschel McWilliams. I'm pleased to welcome tonight one in New York, one in the West Coast, LA, Noah and Miles Evans, fantastic musicians and sons of legendary jazz composer, arranger Gil Evans. And Rob Scheps is here to have a conversation. I've been longtime friends with these guys, and their father knew him. And we'll let him take over from here.
Rob Scheps.
Yeah.
Hi, fellas. The miracle of technology, even during a horrifying pandemic. So in the upper left corner there, we have, if you guys are seeing what we're seeing, that's Noah Evans. And he's actually a little closer to the Bay Area in California coming at us. And below him in the lower left is his brother, Miles Evans. And these fellas are the esteemed progeny of Gil and Anita Evans. Gil Evans, the greatest arranger in the history of jazz music, along with Duke Ellington. I think that's a fair statement. And I'm Rob Scheps. I play saxophone. Actually, Miles and I know each other, not just as friends, but Miles is a really fine trumpet player. And when we work with the Gil Evans Orchestra, Noah Evans is basically our producer, and he's the chief engineer when we record music. So it's kind of amazing to get these guys together, because usually between California and New York, nobody knows where both of them are or if they're on the same coast or what's happening. So anyway, welcome, fellas. Welcome, Noah and Miles Evans. Thank you for joining us tonight, man.
Absolutely, Rob.
Our
Thank
pleasure.
you. Harder to be on the road these days, so yeah, not that difficult to catch us now.
Well, you know what? This is, well, you know, it's like, you know, I was talking to some of the other cats that we're going to be interviewing, you know, like Mark Egan and Glenn Moore, and you know what kind of came up with. The thing is, these are all busy musicians, so for the first time in our lives, you kind of go like, well, when are you free? And the answer is, when do you want to do it? You know, I mean, Mark Egan has some recording to do, but after that, he's like, well, fine, any day. I said to someone else, well, we have this 5-day window. He goes, well, fine, just pick one. You know, so we're not out there working. So, but anyway, but what we're here to talk about, what spurred this whole convo, I've been calling this series Convo Improvo, you dig?
Convo Improvo, cool.
Yeah, it's just sort of like a stupid pseudo-Italian, pseudo-hip jazz term for us having an informal, improvised jazz conversation. You see what I mean?
Ooh, let me get my tobacco pipe and my slippers.
for Convo Improvo. But we're here to talk about basically about Gil Evans in a way that you usually don't get to discuss him. Everybody talks about Gil with Miles Davis and with Sketches of Spain and Jimi Hendrix and everything. But when do people ever get to talk to Gil's family and really hear about Gil, the human, and the father and the family member? And so we're going to get into some pretty interesting things tonight, some of which I know about already from you guys, and some of which one brother might say something and the other brother goes, I never heard that. You know,
That's true.
So, and this came up because when was Gil's birthday? Was it May 13th?
May 13th.
That's correct, yeah.
Right. And so Gil this week would have been 108 years old,
Yes.
which basically, unless you're George Burns, you're not still necessarily going to be here, we wish we had had Gil for a longer time, but we did get him on the planet for 75 years, which is a pretty good start for a guy who wrote that unbelievable music. 55 years or so of incredible, beautiful writing, you know.
That's right.
Yeah, he managed to do a lot in that time period. So
that's true, but he also, like Miles Davis, like his great friend, he really kind of transversed a whole lot of different eras, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
Gil Evans is not like a Fletcher Henderson or Jimmy Lunsford, like here's a guy who stayed in the swing era. Here's a guy who just kept moving with the times no matter what happened musically, right? I'd say
Absolutely.
that Gil always stayed current. Well, one thing I bet a lot of our listeners don't
He
know
tried.
is, did anybody out there know that Gil, at least initially, was Canadian? I mean, Gil Evans to me is like Woody Allen or Wallace Shawn. He's the inveterate New Yorker. He's such a New Yorker that it's hard to remember that at the beginning, your dad was born in Toronto. He was born Canadian. And what was his name when he was born, fellas?
Ian Ernest Gilmore Green.
Yep.
But remember that World War II is what enabled Gil Evans to so easily become an American citizen, because what happened was when he got drafted for World War II, they just turned him into an American citizen in seconds. It was like that.
Yeah,
so that's how it happened so easily.
Yeah, I do remember reading that actually Gil never stopped being a Canadian citizen until he was inducted into the American Army, right?
Well, so keep in mind that Rob,
that's what he told me anyway. That's what Gil told me, that he was, an American citizen until he had to go and be in the Army in World War II.
You mean Canadian citizen first, right?
Yes.
Well, I mean, he was a Canadian citizen up until the early 40s when he had to go to World War II. Then they immediately made him an American citizen. So you're right, and that's a long time because he was born in 1912. So you're right, that's a long time to old. I mean, when you think about it, in 42, he was only 30 years old. So if he was all of a sudden becoming an American citizen by 30, it's still a long time, because when you're young, you think 30 is old.
But see, that's some perspective that none of us really have on Gil Evans, which is here he was like in California and working in America and writing charts and working with bands, and he was still a Canadian citizen. You know, this is so long ago that piece of history gets a little lost, right?
Yeah.
So,
also, Rob,
can we talk real briefly about Gil's parents? So my understanding is that his dad wasn't around, but that he was raised by his mother, and the word peripatetic comes to mind. A lot of kind of moving around. Is that right?
That's correct. Right. And he was shrouded in mystery because he never knew who his father was, and it was very upsetting to him, because that for him was hurtful for his father not to be around. And then the crazy thing was, when he was also very hurt that his mother boarded him with a family, and he felt like she was just going to go run off and gallivant. And he was very upset, and he was young, maybe only 13, something like that, very upset. But that family had the most incredible collection of Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington records. And that, whatever age, whether it was 11, 10, 13, I'm not sure the exact age.
Did I
think Miles froze.
Oh, he froze. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead, Miles. I lost you for a minute.
Yeah, he's still
so
frozen.
Distraught, being left and boarded at a family had the gold that enabled him to do his whole life.
Okay, well, here's my question. So, Noah, for you, when we were talking the other day, getting ready for this, you mentioned you knew a little something about what Gil's mother did and what her jobs were and part of why they were moving around a lot. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, she basically worked as a, they would go across, they started out, as you pointed out, in Toronto, and they went across the whole of Canada, the north, all the way to the West Coast, eventually ended up going down the Pacific Northwest and being here in the Bay Area in Stockton. And she basically would cook and take care of the miners. They would follow the people that were pulling resources out of the ground at that time, and she would make them food, possibly like clean for them and do all that kind
and
of
we
unglamorous work.
you and I, I'm sorry, Noah, we had pointed out when we spoke about this, if Gil was born in 1912, he's a little kid, or he's 10 or he's 15, and he's going around with his mother. I mean, this is like 1920. We're saying this is 100 years ago. That this is how Gil and his mother were living. So it really is another time.
It is basically 100 years ago. If you think about it, not only did he live through both of what they, used to call the Great Wars, but he grew up as a young man through the Great Depression.
Sure.
So that's definitely something that, because imagine going through that like as a, 20-something or a teenager, right? That's got to, have a big impact on forming, how you are.
Right.
And, that was something that honestly, I don't think most people that were born like us after World War II could kind of relate to.
Sure.
Well, I mean, maybe more so nowadays, but before, you know what I mean? Like he really did, I heard rumors of, or maybe I read it in Stephanie's book, where he used to drive a propane truck, as a teenager to make money, to bring home for his mom and, to survive, and did all sorts of
like
stuff
odd
that
jobs,
probably would be illegal, like for a 16-year-old to try to drive a truck now at this point. So.
Yeah, but back then, weed was legal, probably heroin was legal, everything was legal.
Yeah.
But
except for alcohol was illegal for a minute there,
Right.
Yes.
Well, here's a question that comes up. So what I do know is, okay, so Gil ended up, I know that he did go to Stockton High School and he graduated from there. So I realize the irony is you two fellas are really bi-coastal people, and you still are in West Beth and you're in the Village and you're in New York, but you both live in California at least part or sometimes a lot of the time. So has it ever occurred to you that Gil was a Californian, and now to some degree so are both of you?
Well, what I was going to say before, Rob, was that, you have to understand that before, as Miles pointed out, World War II, Gil was a Californian. We only think of him as a New Yorker because we know him like after World War II. You know what I mean? It's hard to imagine him as a Californian. But if you think about it, and Miles, I'm sure would agree about this, Gil loved outdoors and nature and all sorts of things that, and going to the beach and all sorts of things that, if you think about it, kind of made him more a Californian than a New Yorker. He definitely, that part, was still a part of him. You couldn't take out the California.
Right. Well, you mentioned Stephanie's book, and for our viewers, that's, in my opinion, probably the best book about Gil Evans, called Out of the Cool by Stephanie Stein Crease.
Yes.
Like a crease in your jeans.
That's the best book.
It's a very accurate book, and it's well written, and she's perceptive, and she seems to understand the music and get the history mostly right.
And it also has the most information, like this kind of stuff that we're talking about now, like Gil's life and what happened when, and all those kind of things. She did a fantastic job.
She did a great job.
Well, Lee Konitz also.
I'm sorry?
She loves young Lee Konitz.
Lee Konitz. We get to Lee
always
later.
A motherfucker. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's all right. It's a semi-family show, Miles. But
I know. My condolences.
So hold on. So what I want to get to is,
sorry about that.
Hold on. It doesn't matter. Let's get back to the beach, fellas. So I remember reading that there was a place called Balboa Beach where Gil went all the time to basically listen to dance bands and big bands. And my question is, do you think that's where he first got turned on to big band music of one kind or another? Balboa Beach, California.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, he really first got turned on to it when he got boarded as a youngster by his mother, whether it was 10, 11, 12, 13. That house that he got boarded in, he was all depressed and upset that she left. But with that collection of Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington records, that's where he really found it. So he found it at a young age, and it was Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong.
Okay, well, the point is, so he found it on record.
Got into it.
So Miles, he found it on record. I guess what I'm asking is, we're talking about where he started hearing this music live, where he started hearing.
My apologies.
That's okay. Any form of either jazz or big band music, whether it was, hip and swinging or like a sweeter kind of cornier band. I seem to remember there was something about, is it possible that Stan Kenton was like an early kind of like influence, or Gil would go see that band when he was real young, something like that. I don't know. But we all do know that maybe the first gig that Gil had
issues here. I will try to remedy them.
Okay. But the first big band that Gil was really a part of, that is a name band now, where we know about the music, and that seems to have been maybe the first really important gig that he had, was with Claude Thornhill. Would you guys agree with that?
Well, I would say Bob Hope, maybe, though, because he did work with Bob Hope on the West Coast. So maybe the very first, even though it's not as important to us, but if you're just other people that aren't us, maybe the first important gig was with Bob Hope.
Right. And was that live or working for TV or movies?
Radio.
I think that was working for his TV show.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So
that was his first really important gig by most people's standards,
Right. Okay.
Bob Hope was so big,
Sure. Well, and that is the thing. I mean, not a lot of people, when they think about Gil Evans, think about the work he did for Bob Hope. You're right. Most people don't know that. And actually, when you mentioned it last week, I've read the book, but I completely forgotten that.
Well, Miles is right about that, because Bob Hope was very famous back then. Think about it. Like, the majority of the people that would be looking at something at that moment probably, heard of Gil through that first, before, no offense to Claude Thornhill, but you know what I'm saying? Like,
no, I think Bob Hope, like in his real era, was probably like George Carlin or Lucille Ball. I mean, like a comedian that everybody knew about.
Yeah, right.
So I mean, I don't think there's a box set of like Gil Evans music for Bob Hope, but there are definitely recordings that people are still familiar with, of the work that Gil did with Claude Thornhill, right? And my understanding, reading about Claude Thornhill, he had a really unusual big band. For one thing, sometimes there would be 6 clarinets on one chart. I mean, who even has that many woodwind players? And then Claude Thornhill, I think it's really important to say, even when this was, and forgive me if I got the dates wrong, definitely 40s, maybe 30s also, but using
40s.
Okay, using French horn and tuba in a jazz big band, which is not a normal thing. It's become very normal in the canon of Gil Evans music, going all the way back to the 50s and going back even before. But my theory is maybe that Gil got turned on to using French horn and tuba in a jazz big band with Claude, and he dug it so much that he was almost never without it.
And
it's possible, but it's also possible that Claude, found it, and so did Gil Evans, and that they found it separately before they met each other, and then came together with it. It's also possible that happened as well.
I think the classical music influence was a factor too, gentlemen.
Some of the classical music that Claude arranged in a jazz.
But also that Gil was so into classical.
Yeah,
he was so into Debussy or Stravinsky. Or he was into Ravel. You can even hear it. You can hear sometimes some Ravel chords. The Miles Ahead record. I'm not going to say which song, but there's one song that I'm thinking of specifically that definitely has Ravel chords in it. So Gil was so into the classical and so many different classical artists that he might have picked it up from there. You never know.
It's possible, but certainly, I'm just saying there really were no big bands at the time of Claude Thornhill that had French horn and tuba aside from Claude Thornhill. I think another weird influence might be, you remember how, at least in the 70s and the 80s, when we were kids, that Gil Evans was a relatively hands-off band leader. I would not call him like a conducting control freak. I mean, in fact, sometimes at Sweet Basil, it could be chaos. And my question is,
you saw him in his later years when he was the Obi-Wan Kenobi with all the most incredible, interesting cats.
I know, but this is not my point, Miles. My point is, in the way that most people lead their bands in a very specific way, like Buddy Rich or Stan Kenton or Woody Herman, they're conducting, they're setting tempos, they're doing things. I guess what I'm saying is, I read that Claude Thornhill had an incredible band that he wasn't really able to control. And I wonder if his sort of hands-off, laissez-faire approach might have influenced Gil, or if that's just who Gil was going to be anyway. Let me tell you.
I think that's who Gil was.
Well, let me tell you the one
I
story
love
that
the way
makes
Gil and Miles both use their instruments to cue the band, and I love that. Miles with his trumpet, Gil
right.
with the piano.
Well,
So
let me
that
get
was
to Claude
cool, too.
Thornhill before we go on.
Go
Let
ahead.
me really quick. Sorry. So the story that I read was Claude Thornhill had Gene Quill in the band, great alto player, great clarinet player, and he wanted Gene to stand up for his clarinet solo, and Gene didn't want to do it. So Claude asked him again, and he wanted him to stand up. So Gene Quill stood up on his chair, played his clarinet solo, turned to Claude, gave him the finger, and sat down. And so for Gene Quill to kind of behave like that and not get fired leads me to believe that Claude Thornhill kind of let the guys, act the way they wanted. And just when you think about Gil in the 70s and 80s, it was also, and actually, come to think of it, there people would say that Duke Ellington, his players would come on stage a little late and they'd have an attitude. And so it's just interesting that Claude kind of left the band alone, and later in life, so did Gil.
Well, think about it too. To work with Gil, you had to be a little bit like that, because, you know what I mean, you weren't going to get anything other than what you were going to get. Right. And I think as far as Gil, it's amazing how at the same time that he was a super attention to detail, maybe a borderline perfectionist when it came to being in the studio and keep doing take after take after take. But yet at the same time, as we all have just discussed, he would sit there at Sweet Basil and basically let people do almost anything that they wanted, and he wouldn't even he barely lift an eyebrow. You know what I mean? If someone,
right, but you know what? Yeah, I agree, Noah. But I guess we're kind of conflating two different periods, because when
that's still how Gil was, though.
Right. I guess I'm just saying, when Gil wrote a chart for Claude Thornhill, or when he was dealing with Miles Ahead and Porgy and Bess, I know that he had really exacting scores and he was conducting. And if you read about him, he would drive people crazy with taking so many takes, because everyone else, the musicians and the producer alike, would be feeling like, man, you got it already. That was perfect. And so were the two before it. And what I read was, back in those days when Gil was still wearing a suit and tie and writing for oboes, that, he would, no, man, we really just need one more. And there's a guy named Davy Kurtzer who recorded with Gil. Do you remember that name at all?
No.
Well, he's the guy who plays bassoon, only bassoon, on the record Gil Evans Plus 10, in that little small big band with Lee Konitz and Steve Lacy. And I did a gig in the Catskills once, and there's Davy Kurtzer playing baritone sax. And I said to him, "Hey man, you're that guy, aren't you? You're the bassoonist on Gil Evans Plus 10. And Kurtzer goes, "Yeah, that's me." And I said, "Well, man, that must have been incredible." And the first thing he said to me, with no malice, was, he goes, "Man, it was awful." He goes, "I had to play a high B flat on the bassoon, and Gil made me do 15 takes in a row." And that was before I had ever read in the book, or probably even met you guys, where I was hearing from someone who had worked with Gil in the studio. Yeah, there was a real perfectionism about him. And
if you look at the Gil documentary, Rob, there's an interview, classic in my opinion, with George Avakian, and he lays it out really well about how Gil was a perfectionist in the studio, and how he wasn't even thinking that, well, maybe the brass guy's chops were done, you know what I mean, and he want another take, you know what I mean.
And I'm sure, sure, knowing Gil, that he wasn't inconsiderate, he was hyper focused.
Totally, that's exactly right, Rob. That's exactly right.
So let's talk about this. So,
but just quickly, I just wanted to say quickly that, getting back to that at Basil quickly, I mean, it is amazing that when you have musicians like Jaco Pastorius, George Adams, Hiram Bullock, and Lou Soloff, it's nice to be able to do that and feel comfortable that you can do that, because you've got incredible musicians like that. And so
that's for later. That's Miles. Forgive me, Miles, but that's for later. It's like we're saving dessert. So what I want to ask you fellas about was, well, first of all, wasn't Claude Thornhill's theme something that Gil wrote called Snowfall? Does that sound right?
I'm sorry, say one more time.
It sounds like, I'm not sure. It sounds like a possibility.
Okay, remember, but not so much in the 70s or 80s, but back in the 40s or 50s, a big band would have a theme song. Like Woody Herman had Woodchopper's Ball, and Duke Ellington might have used Take the A Train. And my understanding is that the theme song for the Claude Thornhill band was Snowfall, and that was one of your father's charts. Does that ring any bells?
I have to default to Miles.
It sounds familiar. I apologize that I can't
I guess
confirm
we'll all have to
100%.
go back to the drawing board via YouTube or something
Yeah.
and check it out. Well,
Exactly. Or maybe
okay, so
Stephanie's book again.
so here's the question then. So after Claude Thornhill, do you guys have a sense of when Gil left California for New York and why?
Well, I know why, because he told me.
Exactly.
He
Okay.
said that the reason why he left California was because he had to get to where all the great music was happening on 52nd Street. So he had to leave, and he had to hang with,
No.
Charlie Parker and Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie,
Yeah.
and talk to Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, all the people. He had to leave California and get to where the real shit was happening on 57th.
And certainly there's always been a lot of great jazz. There's been a lot of great jazz in California too, but those people that he was seeking, Bird and
back
Miles.
then, that was the place. Come on, you know it. I mean,
see, this is the New Yorker part of him talking, but
well, also in Gil's mind though, too, Miles is right. That was what Gil was thinking, and you have to keep in mind, World War II is a big, a big point, a marcation in time. You know what I mean? So Gil was kind of a West Coaster before World War II, but after, he wanted to do anything he could.
So we're talking like 1942 to 1945, World War II, somewhere in there is around the time that Gil went after World War II.
After World War II.
Yeah, Gil, it was probably about in the middle of 44 or something like that, or the beginning of 1944 that he was there, and all those amazing people.
Well, it just occurred to me, I forgot, probably before Gil ever met Charlie Parker, he had a chart of anthropology that Claude Thornhill's band recorded. So there's Gil in California already arranging bebop, which was, pretty avant-garde, revolutionary at that time.
Absolutely.
And of course, there's something about Gil, like a lot of timeless artists, like Mozart or James Brown or John Coltrane, the music never sounds dated. So you hear that arrangement of anthropology, and let's say it's whatever it is, 1944 or something, and you say, wow, man, that's a hip arrangement. You don't say, gee, that sounds like the 40s, Well, so now there are certain things that everybody has heard about Gil Evans, and there's other stuff that we're going to hopefully elucidate a little bit tonight. But one cliche about the life of Gil Evans that everybody knows is the meeting place, the apartment on West 52nd Street, I guess behind or below a Chinese laundry, the place where supposedly the informal symposia of the cats, like Jerry Mulligan and George Russell and Johnny Carisi and John Lewis, basically led to the birth of the Cool recordings and sessions and gig at the Royal Roost. What do you guys know, if anything, about that apartment that Gil had?
Well, what we know is that it was this incredible place where so many people came together to explore the music and have these incredibly creative ideas and to break the mold and to do the impossible. And it produced this amazing record called Birth of the Cool.
Well, this is 1949, and I would think for most jazz listeners, Birth of the Cool is the earliest Gil Evans record that they really know about. And 1949, what I would say is, I don't know if Miles really put the band together. It doesn't really matter as far as that kind of credit, but I think the arranging credit is important because Gil wasn't the only arranger on Birth of the Cool. Jerry Mulligan wrote a couple of the charts, Jeru and maybe Venus de Milo, and John Lewis wrote a little bit, and there were other writers. But when people think of that record, they really think of the first collaboration on record of music that we're all familiar with, of Gil Evans arranging music that Miles Davis played on. And one piece, if you're listening to Birth of the Cool, where you know for sure that it was Gil's arrangement, is Moon Dreams. And that's really a beautiful, amazing arrangement that's really
gorgeous.
Kind of, it's forward looking. You hear Moon Dreams in 1949, you go, wow, man, that sounds gorgeous. Like,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
quality stuff.
Baplicity was really, I think, my father's composition and arrangement. Maybe Miles was in there, because my father loved to copy out Miles solos or Miles phrases. And that's fair to say. It's fair to say that they both wrote it because of that.
Right.
But
Well, I mean,
bet you
Boplicity
Gil
has
did all
kind
the
of been
writing.
attributed to Gil and Miles hyphenated,
And-
but remember who
Yeah, and even though Gil allowed Miles to give it to Miles Davis's mother, it still was Gil's, and he
right.
was
So
just a
Miles,
beautiful,
let me
nice gentleman.
clarify that. Hold on. Let me clarify that. So
Go,
Boplicity
Rob.
got a composer's credit of Cleo Henry, which, as Miles just mentioned, that was Miles Davis's mother, who clearly did not write Boplicity. So that's
Really?
yes. Well, and there could be any number of reasons for that, but when you do that, sometimes you're trying to keep somebody from getting your publishing, or whatever,
Oh no, it's true.
or you're trying to give your mom some royalties or something. But so we just want the world to know, when you see Boplicity written by Cleo Henry, BS. Miles Davis's mother did not write Boplicity. Let's say that it was some combination of Gil Evans and Miles Davis who wrote that music.
I don't think you have to listen to more than 4 bars, Rob, to
Uh-huh.
know that that's true.
Yes. Well,
I mean, but it really could have been all Gil Evans. I mean, that's the truth.
Well,
that is, yeah.
Okay. And I think that point just at this moment is moot, because we know that Gil did a lot of things where he didn't get full or any credit, and then other things where he did get the proper credit. But so what I want to ask you fellas is, when you read jazz history books and you read about Birth of the Cool, and you hear about that apartment of Gil's where all those amazing musicians used to congregate and hang out and drink and talk about jazz and talk about the Lydian chromatic concept with George Russell, and where a lot of important things seem to have been born. The question is about Miles and Gil maybe meeting for the first time. What I remember in Miles's book is he said, the first time I saw Gil, he was just standing there, this tall white guy with a snap brim cap and a bag of raw radishes with salt. And Miles basically just said he was hipper than shit standing there with that hat and that bag of radishes. And I wonder if you guys can give a short answer for where and when those two guys first met. Do you have any idea?
I'll let Miles go.
No, I don't know exactly where they met, but it was definitely someplace very close to 52nd Street, if not on 52nd Street. But I don't know exactly where it was. But I will say, just wanted to quickly say that Gil Evans did tell me that Birth of the Cool was his idea. So I just figured I would say
that is really important information, Miles. Thank you for that. I mean, and because as we know, Gil was not an attention hog. So if he said it was my idea, it was his idea.
Totally.
Yeah,
Gil did not.
Right. Although, and I want to say this, I feel like, if people ever say to me, oh yeah, man, that great Miles Davis record, Porgy and Bess, or that great Miles Davis record, Miles Ahead, and you know how much I love Gil's music too, and I have to step in, I have to go, wait a minute. Now, yes, that is a Miles Davis record, but let me explain something to you. When people say to me, well, I don't know who Gil Evans is, or maybe they're not musicians, I say 100% of that music was arranged by Gil Evans. So what you're hearing, aside from those gorgeous, perfect Miles Davis solos, is the music of Gil Evans. These are Miles Davis - Gil Evans records. They are not Miles Davis records.
Yeah, again, listen to the George Avakian interview where he clearly says how, especially the term he used was the repertoire that they chose. That was all Gil's idea for the most part, about who the composers he wanted to do was, the tunes, all that kind of stuff. And one little thing was, and what you guys are saying before is true too. Gil would even, much to people's surprise, actually write out the solos sometimes. And some of those solos that we think of as solos, meaning improvised, are actually kind of sketched out ahead of time.
Well, that's an interesting point, Noah, because as we get into Gil's later music tonight, and maybe if we don't get it all covered, we can come and convo again here.
Let's do it.
Gil Evans, to me, going back to the beginning of his career as an arranger and a composer, had an unusual way of blurring the lines between composition and improvisation, where other people would go, here's letter A through C, and this is all the written stuff, and then at D, you take a solo. And I think Gil, I'd like to get into this bit of it a little later, but the idea of Gil taking people's improvisations in the moment, writing them down and turning them into compositions, I think that was a distinctly Gil Evans way of creating. And so if we look at those records, there are 3 classic records that everybody knows of Gil Evans writing incredible, beautiful jeweled frames that featured Miles Davis in the most perfect fashion. So after Birth of the Cool, which whatever you want to call it, but it's a swing and bebop record, you know?
Yep.
And the three records we're talking about, and I'm not going to be too concerned about the order, but Miles Ahead, Porgy and Bess, and Sketches of Spain. And maybe we could talk for a moment about each of those. So now, one thing, I just read a book about Miles Davis's later years with the electric music in the 70s and 80s and through 91. And one thing that I read was when Miles did Miles Ahead, they first put the record out and they put a white woman on the cover of the record. And Miles Davis basically said to the powers that be at Columbia, this is bullshit. I'm black. Black women are beautiful. Why is there a white chick on my album cover? I'm just being blunt here, and I'm not telling tales out of school.
Hold on. Because you look at the movie, the Miles movie covers that. If you look at the Miles movie,
the latest documentary Miles movie does,
But so the thing is, and apparently, and you know, and this was a daring thing to do, you know, to get up against your record company and say, look, I'm not happy with this, and to do what Miles Davis did. I think, you know, racially and socially, it was a courageous thing to do. But the first copies of Miles Ahead had a white woman on the cover, and when they reprinted it, there was a black woman on the cover. So Miles got his way, and he broke some interesting ground. But the thing about Miles Ahead is,
might even be
it's music from Sketches of Spain is one kind of thing, and Porgy and Bess is all Gershwin from one opera.
Yep.
But Miles Ahead is it's typical Gil Evans. It's this incredible grab bag of 10 different pieces by extremely different composers that sort of hangs together as a beautiful whole, with a W, whole. And what I noticed listening to that record that you often forget about Miles Ahead, it used to be side one and side two, right? 5 songs on each side, but the music never stops. There's a segue. There might be one little note hanging over in the tuba or the French horn that it will be a bridge between the first song and the second song. So the first 5 songs of Miles Ahead, the music never quits. It might have been recorded in chunks, but it's just interesting that Gil made everything into a suite, not just a bunch of separate tracks, you know, separate bands. So you've got The Duke by Dave Brubeck. Then you've got Maids of Cadiz by Leo Delibes, who's a classical composer. You got this silly pop tune, I Don't Want to Be Kissed, which is swinging and great. Then you've got the first thing we hear on the record is Springsville by Johnny Carisi, who was a trumpet player and who was one of the guys hanging out in that Gil apartment during Birth of the Cool time. So, but you basically had Gil saying, I'm going to take a little bit of Delibes, I'm going to take this Brubeck, I'm going to grab this and this and this, and then he wrote Blues for Pablo, and he's got New Rumba. But somehow that collection of pieces hangs together so beautifully. What would you fellas like to say about Miles Ahead?
It's a beautiful piece of music, and you're right. I love the way he did that, and it just shows off Gil's amazing ability to arrange beautiful music with incredible influences of Ravel and others.
He wasn't just a jazz guy. He was. We said this last week. Remember that we kind of agreed that Gil was always an omnivore as far as the music that he dug and the music that he arranged or wrote from. I made a little list and I was going to read it. Here's some of what we know is Gil Evans' favorite musicians, and they're really disparate. So here's the short list: Louis Armstrong, George Gershwin, Jelly Roll Morton, Sting and the Police, Jimi Hendrix, Manuel de Falla, Willie Dixon. And the list, actually, when you're not hip to Gil, the list actually sounds kind of insane. It's like the list of a schizophrenic or something. But the truth is, you guys, while we were thinking about those names, each of us remembered, oh, that's a piece that was a Louis Armstrong thing he did. That was some. So can you guys speak to the fact that Gil always seemed to have an incredibly open mind, that he wasn't just listening to bebop and swing things, and he was listening to all kinds of music, but also finding in that music things that he could bring into a jazz big band, context?
Yeah, he absolutely was someone that wasn't limited like that. He didn't think of like the record, because like you're saying, like Porgy and Bess, that's all Gershwin tunes, right? But
Yeah.
more Gil is like the way Miles Ahead is, where you're taking like this kind of palette of different, you know what I mean? You're trying to make it more like have some more variety there. And Gil's taste was wide ranging. So yeah, he would draw from all over, huge classical fan, as we discussed before. There's
Right.
honestly very few types of music that he would make any sort of disparaging comments about. There's very few things that come to mind. I know he wasn't the hugest country fan. No offense to you country folk.
Well, you know what Buddy Rich said about that? Buddy Rich was in the hospital, and they said, "Buddy, do you have any allergies?" And he said, "Yeah, country and Western music." It's a famous line, which I imagine that Gil would have handled that question a different way. But I understand why Buddy said it. Well, so I mean, I think, and Miles, you made this point earlier, you keep going back to Ravel and Stravinsky, but I think it's really interesting to realize if you listen to the beautiful sounds Gil Evans creates, if you're not remembering that he was digging classical music, you're missing a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, definitely.
Would you say?
I would definitely say so. Yeah.
Well, and so
Right.
So how about these other amazing records that Miles and Gil collaborated on? The really kind of perfect ones with Porgy and Bess. You have basically, I mean, I've played that piece. I went on a tour with the Charleston Symphony from South Carolina playing Porgy and Bess, which is interesting because that's where it's based. It's based in South Carolina. But so there's Gil looking at Porgy and Bess and saying, I'm going to take this whole half jazz, half classical opera, and I'm going to use it as a setting for Miles Davis. And as we know, this is an experiment that worked extraordinarily well. Do you have any insight on how or when or why Gil might have chosen Porgy and Bess for Miles?
I don't know exactly why, but I do know that Gil Evans loved the way Miles Davis. All right, do you have me? I apologize.
No, we've got you. We got you, Miles.
Yeah. Gil Evans loved the way Miles Davis could sing a song on the trumpet, and so there's so many beautiful melodies, and I would guess that one of the reasons is because of that fact that Miles Davis could sing a song so beautifully on the trumpet, beautiful melodies, and the interesting music that Gil did such an amazing job on. But it's true that I do not know. I wish I could have interviewed Gil, but I didn't get to interview him and ask him that question. So I really don't know.
I guess my question even more simply would be, do you think that Gil or Miles chose Porgy and Bess, or maybe they came to it together?
Yeah, that's a good question. They might have come to it together. I mean, even if I said what I said about maybe Boplicity being Gil's composition, or, Gil having done all of the arranging and writing it out. I mean, Miles Davis and Gil did compose together, and Miles Davis, was a great sound innovator and an incredible musician. So,
right.
I mean, I want to make it clear that Miles is this amazing, magical musician that is out of this world. And that's why when you have two great innovators like that, Gil Evans, the next great sound after Duke Ellington, and Miles Davis, the next great sound on the trumpet after Louis Armstrong. So when you have that come together like that, it's this unbelievable mixture. And that is what you have and had with Gil Evans and Miles Davis.
Okay, well, thank you, Miles. Well, let me point out a couple of things about Porgy and Bess I've noticed about over the years. So, of course, you have some classic melodies that a lot of folks know, like Summertime and It Ain't Necessarily So. Man, they swing their asses, don't they? The way Gil wrote them. I mean, the tempos and the just boom, 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 for It Ain't Necessarily So. And using French horns to comp, sounding like the left hand of a piano. And, of course, that arrangement of Summertime is just totally classic. But here are two things I noticed that Gil did that were new on Porgy and Bess. On the song I Loves You, Porgy, that's a beautiful, beautiful ballad. Bill Evans recorded it. It's, it has really beautiful moving chord changes. But what Gil did was he made it so that there was just one scale and one chord happening. And what I was told was that Miles was given a scale by Gil to improvise on. Don't improvise on these changes. Use this scale. And there was just this kind of cycle, this like mobile of flutes and other things happening, so that I Loves You Porgy became a melody over kind of a static bottom instead of a traditional bunch of moving chords. And that works really beautifully. The other thing is, you know, the piece Gone or Orgone or whatever we called it later in the Gil Evans band, the electric band, well, that song is actually, what happened is Gershwin had a piece in Porgy and Bess called Gone, Gone, Gone. And it's right. It's that melody, but it's really slow.
Exactly.
You can hear it so beautifully on Porgy and Bess. You know, it's just so cool the way you can hear it. You can listen to Gone, 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 and then listen to Gone, and you can hear that. And
but that's my point. Gershwin only wrote Gone, 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 the ballad version, and Gil said, let me write Gone. Let me turn this into a fast bebop tune, exactly. a bunch of drum breaks for Philly Joe Jones, and let Miles play his ass off over it. And then that became one of the staples of the Gil Evans repertoire for the rest of his life.
Totally. So even in the Basil days.
Well, see, the thing is, if you look at what Gil was playing in the 70s and 80s, Gone and Summertime were still in the mix. I Loves You Porgy and Strawberry Devil Crab were not in the mix. I guess what I'm saying is
11 too, because
it had a lot of legs with Gil. I mean, some of the Porgy and Bess stuff stayed in his repertoire for decades after that, right?
Absolutely.
No, it's true, and it's just beautiful the way he modernized it. But it's also beautiful, as we touched on, Rob, that Gil Evans had this amazing ability to literally take the same song, but voice it so beautifully for so many different instrumentations. And he was just so brilliant at that. But also on top of that, giving it a lot of other flavor, just whether it wasn't as simple as adding electric instruments, it would give it this amazing flavor that would be so different than the previous version. And it was everything all together.
Well, you're right, Miles.
Not just the, redoing and reharmonizing, but just everything together. So it was really interesting the way I've never really heard another arranger do it so beautifully. Like
in my personal opinion, no one has ever done it more beautifully. But you bring up an important point. Gil created sounds that nobody else ever created, but he didn't do them with a traditional big band. Gil Evans never recorded with a big band that was 4 or 5 trumpets, 3 or 4 trombones, and 5 saxophones. And this is evidenced by, Miles, do you remember when you hired me to play Sketches of Spain in New York, and I was living in Portland, Oregon full time? And I said, and you said, okay, we're doing Sketches of Spain at Symphony Space. And I said, well, what do I need? What instruments do I need, man? And you go, you need flute, alto flute, clarinet, and bass clarinet. That's my bad Miles Evans imitation. And anyway, and I said, okay, that's all fine. And then I said, but Miles, which saxophone am I playing? I'll never forget. You said, bro, there are no saxophones on Sketches of Spain. And that just kicked my ass, because of course you knew this from living with Gil, probably playing the music, probably having seen the score. It never occurred to me, here's one of the greatest jazz big band records ever written, and there are 0 saxophones. So what I'm trying to say is, to me, one of Gil's innovations was changing the instrumentation of the big band before he even wrote anything.
Totally.
And remember, no, you're right. But the one thing is, I mean, I would have to really listen intensely to the record, because as Noah and I have talked about, those recordings aren't always perfect. So it would have really been cool to have heard a 24-track recording, because who knows, that's what, we got from the music. That's what we got, and it's on the music. But who knows? And if we really listened hard, who knows? Maybe there really is a saxophone on the original record.
Well, no. We know where the saxophone is. I'm going to tell you, because I know where it is on these records. On Sketches of Spain, there are 0 saxophones. On Porgy and Bess, there's only Lee Konitz on alto sax And on Miles Ahead, same thing. There's
But are
only
you
Lee.
sure if you were to listen to Sketches
Yes.
of Spain
Yes.
super
Yes.
intensely that you could not even
Yes,
hear
yes,
one
yes.
of them?
So what I'm
Yeah, I
saying
mean,
is,
I
look,
never have, but I just wanted to be
Okay.
certain that you did that.
Here's my point. Gil wrote for 5 trumpets, which is kind of big. Okay. Stan Kenton had 5 trumpets. Woody Herman always did, but most big bands had 4. So heavy on the trumpets, 3 or 4 trombones, and always at least 2 French horns, Jimmy Buffington or Gunther Schuller or Ray Alonji. And always, you're not going to catch Gil Evans dead on a record without a tuba in
No,
1960.
it's true. But you know, sometimes Gil Evans did do 4 trumpets, you know, back in the day.
Yeah, that's not my point. My point is heavy on the brass, because the French horns and tuba you would consider extra in a big band,
Oh,
right?
definitely.
But then here's, to me, this is what really makes Gil Evans different right from Miles Ahead, is 4 or 5 of the best woodwind doublers in New York City playing clarinet, bass clarinet, alto flute, oboe, occasionally piccolo, and a little bit of alto sax. So really kind of heavy on the flutes and oboe and bass clarinet, replacing a traditional sax section. And Gil was doing that not just for a novelty, he was doing it on every tune. And I think that's part of the sound of Gil Evans to begin with. Do you agree? All those woodwinds.
I agree. I also agree with what you said about brass. I mean, to me, Gil always had, he always, you know, it was definitely the focus, right? The trumpets, not only in how they were voiced, arranged, and all that, but too with the players. I mean, some of those cats, some of the best trumpets in the world, and that
Ernie Royal and Louis Mucci and Taft Jordan. Yeah. So I guess all I'm saying is on these records,
that's
Sketches
the point
of Spain.
Of the spear. The point of the spear is the trumpets.
I'm sorry?
The point of the spear is the trumpets.
The point of the spear, that's interesting. So again, if the listener wants to go back and listen to Miles Davis, Gil Evans, Porgy and Bess, Miles Ahead, Sketches of Spain, you're going to hear a very large brass section augmented by French horns and tubas, and you're going to hear all kinds of interesting woodwinds, some of which, like alto flute and bass clarinet and oboe, were not used all the time in jazz at that point.
That's safe to say.
Yeah, I mean, when you're listening to a Gil Evans record and you hear oboe in the mix, or an oboe or a bassoon solo, you can say already, hey, this is pretty original. This is not a normal jazz sound. And
totally.
But I feel that Gil Evans made that his sound, having all those woodwinds.
Yeah. I think some of that too is the classical influence. You know, there's definitely instruments he wasn't afraid to tango with, and that's clear. You know,
sure,
it's awesome.
Well, and then we should probably talk about Sketches for a minute. So, Sketches of Spain, as I learned in I think it was the late '90s from Miles Evans, right there, bro. There are no saxophones on Sketches of Spain, so everybody can take that piece of information. Go listen to that record. You will not, even if there's sometimes occasional blips in the credits and people getting things wrong, there's still no saxophones on Sketches of Spain. And the thing is, we should probably dedicate tonight's convo to Lee Konitz, who passed away just a couple weeks ago, who amazingly was the last living member of Birth of the Cool. And we forget this, but the last, not the very last, but one of the last living musicians who played on Miles Ahead and Porgy and Bess. And I remember reading about some of the racial issues that used to happen in jazz back then, and Miles Davis basically saying, I don't care if a cat is, what do you say, purple with green spots, if he can play, because someone had asked him about having Lee Konitz in his band.
Yeah, he would basically say, like, you know, or he said actually, well, you get me someone who can play like that, and then I'll use them, right? And that's where the commonality with Gil and Miles was, because Gil was the same thing. He was just about like the results, like who did it, where that came from. That was a different thing. And the other thing I wanted to say is Miles and I earlier were both going to say, hey, condolences to the Konitz family.
Absolutely.
He was a fantastic gentleman.
We are so sorry.
There's some great there's some great stuff on gilevans.com on the music page with interviews that are, in my mind, classic. I love them. They're priceless on there with Gil and Lee. So it's worth checking out, you guys.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so want to talk about Sketches of Spain really quickly. So, you know, it's kind of amazing that Miles Davis as an African American person sounded so deeply Spanish, like to the soul on Sketches of Spain. There, to me, there's some way that Miles was able to capture a Hispanic spirit in a way that was certainly aided by the music that Gil wrote. And I'm wondering if that record started because of the Concerto de Aranjuez, the Rodrigo piece. You know, when you put on Sketches of Spain and you hear the harp and those clicking castanets and that twinkling sound that Gil gets, you know, that first piece is the Concerto de Aranjuez, which is actually for classical guitar, is it not? And I guess I'm wondering, do you think Sketches of Spain as a project started with that piece? Does anybody have an idea?
I don't know, but I would just say
I don't really know.
You would say what now?
I would just say that, you know, that's also another measurement of really how good they were. And in that sense, how good Miles was. To your point, I mean, he really sounded authentic. And when you can actually absorb and imbibe, you know, that, and then, you know, then project that out, that's what you kind of got, you know what I mean? And they were both, that's the common thing. I mean, they were both able to kind of chameleon into like these different, you know, realms.
Or personae.
Yeah. And also too, I mean, you know, the talent level that's required with that too, because it's one thing to be able to want to do it and think it in your head, but it's another thing to be able to actually execute it. And, you know, obviously was able to do that. So much,
and I feel like
emotion.
The emotion is incredible on that record.
Much emotion.
And the and also typical of Gil Evans is he's pretty generous in that most of the pieces on the record are not composed by him, but they're all arranged by him. So you have the Concerto de Aranjuez by Rodrigo, by the classical composer, and then you have Saeta and Will o' the Wisp, which I think are taken from like folk melodies that were already there. But then you have Solea, which is incredible, but was really written by
Gil Evans.
That's right. And
that's right.
And you remember when we played that at Symphony Space in New York, Miles, we had Maria Schneider conducting. And we'd also like to dedicate tonight's broadcast to another recent victim of this horrible disease, Wallace Roney. Great trumpet player. So I don't remember what year this was, guys, but it was probably around 1999, 2000 when it was wall-to-wall Miles at Symphony Space, which was an all-day festival of Miles Davis's music played by all kinds of people. And I want to share something from that.
That was in like the year 2000.
Maybe the year
2000 or 2001.
Yes. Yeah. And what I was going to say is when we played Sketches of Spain there, we played the 5 pieces from the record, and Miles, you were the soloist on one of them, and Wallace was the soloist on the other 4. And it was incredible.
Yeah, I was on Concerto de Aranjuez.
Okay. Well, the point being that if you're going to play the music that Gil Evans wrote for Miles Davis, and you can't get Miles Davis, you better get Wallace Roney. That's the closest you're going to get in terms of sound and approach.
Right.
Right.
That was terrible hearing of his passing. I know.
We're dedicating everything we're doing tonight to 2 great soloists who played this Gil Evans music, Wallace Roney and Lee Konitz. So
condolences
to them and their families, like you say, condolences.
Thank you, Rob.
Sure, of course. Now, I want to tell you guys something I learned at that gig, and I want your reaction to this. So we played with our big band, essentially the Gil Evans Orchestra, conducted by Maria Schneider, featuring Wallace Roney. And then we were in the back, and Jimmy Cobb was on the festival, and he had been playing with Eddie Henderson and Joe Locke. I don't remember who else was in that band. So there's Jimmy Cobb in the dressing room, and I thought, oh my God, this is an incredible opportunity. So I said, Jimmy, can I ask you a question? You know, on those Columbia records, they didn't really put the personnel on the back of some of the records, and you know, you can't get the information. I said, can I ask you a question? Who played drums on Sketches of Spain, you or Elvin Jones? And Jimmy goes, I'll never forget. It's not a good Jimmy Cobb impersonation. I don't know Jimmy well. I met him a few times, but he says, I played drums and Elvin played percussion. And so I said, well, who played castanets on Sketches of Spain? And Jimmy looks at me and goes, Elvin. So that's something you're never going to get out of a book. So the next time you guys listen to Sketches of Spain, that is not like some symphony percussionist or some timbale player doubling on castanets for 10 bars. That's Elvin. So Jimmy Cobb on drums, Elvin Jones on percussion. Isn't that heavy?
That's heavy. That kind of carried through
heavy.
because if you think about it, Gil liked to have not just drums but percussion also. So it would be common that we would have multiple drummers, and in that case, you know, and the other drummers do, but play percussion. So
well, I was listening to There Comes a Time from 1975 earlier today, and I realized, well, on that record, you've got Tony Williams, Bruce Ditmas, and Sue Evans, and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
And that's a perfect example because in the 70s,
and Warren Smith also.
Exactly. And and like even live, like if you look at any of the video clips, you'll see like there's whoever's playing the drums, whether it's Bruce or Sue or, you know, whoever's playing the drums, but everybody else is shaking something or hitting something or doing, you know what I mean? It was always this kind of thing where there was like a group percussion. So they all just grabbed. There was no ego there, you know what I mean? They just all were like happy to be doing, you know, playing with Gil Evans and doing it.
Yeah, I mean, well, speaking of happy to play with Gil Evans, I'm thinking about Tony Williams was one of the 2 or 3 most famous drummers in the world by 1965. Yet 10 years later, he still chooses to make a record with the Gil Evans Orchestra because he was Tony's at the top of the world, but who wouldn't want to play with Gil? And I could imagine Tony, and not only that, Gil recorded Tony's composition, There Comes a Time. So they obviously,
each other too.
They still had a relationship quite after Tony's time with Miles Davis and Herbie.
They loved each other. Yeah, Gil loved Tony.
Who wouldn't?
Period. Gil loved Tony, period.
You know.
Well, now, can I get you fellas into another area of Gil's 60s big band writing? So now we're all going to start laughing when I mention the words commercial music and Gil Evans in the same sentence. And we're going to get to that later in a way. But you guys have kind of taught me as Gil's sons, he did do some commercial music in his life, but he pretty much only did the crap he wanted to do, right?
Yes.
That's right.
And that for the most part in Gil Evans' mind and life and work, money was not a primary consideration most of the time. Would you agree?
I would agree. That was not the first. That was not the first. Yeah, that was not the first factor in a decision-making process for him. He probably felt a little bit more pressure after he had Miles and I. All of a sudden, he's not just himself making these decisions to do whatever he wants. He has to support him. So I bet there was some conflict for him in that, but he still was Gil. He still would turn down like high-paying like jingles or soundtracks to movies or these kind of things, just because, or even, you know, working for other people, as you and I had discussed, Rob. I don't want to mention the names, but you know,
I've got some names, Noah, and I appreciate that. So
you can do that.
I wanted our listeners to have the insight that Gil very often turned down the money and turned down the big, as Miles would say, the deaf bread and the totally mint paycheck. But he did do some commercial things, but we have to assume that Gil, like a good actor or actress, you know, before we found out what a piece of shit he was, Kevin Spacey, a great actor, you never really saw him in bad movies. You never see Catherine Keener or John Malkovich in a bad movie. They tend to seem to pick their projects and they just do what they think is the good stuff.
Exactly.
And I think Gil Evans is a guy who just really didn't want to write any crap, but he did have a respect for pop music. So there are 5 CDs, well, we call them CDs now. There are 5 records that he wrote for other artists in the 50s and 60s, and I want to mention them briefly.
You can call them albums.
And get your reactions. Okay, I'm just going to mention the artist, and these are people that Gil Evans did agree to write a whole record for. The first one is the unusual guy who played vibraphone and mellophone, Don Elliott. He wrote a record for Don Elliott.
Yes. They did Jamaica Jazz was the name of that album.
Oh, really? Okay.
Jamaica Jazz. You know, if anyone goes back and checks that out, if they can get a copy or download a copy or whatever, and kudos to Dorian and Dean if they're on watching the son and daughter of Don.
Right.
I would just say that's a fantastic album, honestly.
And it's not well known. There's some songs
not
on
at
it
all
like
well known.
I think there's a tune called Napoleon. And there's a tune called Push the Button, which I found out later is from some Broadway show. But so I guess I'm saying why would Gil have said yes to Don Elliott and no to some other people? He's an unusual musician. Mellophone is kind of like a French horn.
Yeah, it was a clicking thing. You know what I mean, Rob? It was like one of those things where like they just clicked, right? Like they liked each other. So I mean, and that's Gil's that simple sometimes. Like he'll work on something just because, you know, whether or not he likes the actual repertoire or he likes the artist. And in this case, he was very fond of Don Elliott.
That's nice to hear. Well, now, when you consider how few singers Gil Evans worked behind, wouldn't you say that any singer who had Gil arrange their entire record was a very lucky duck indeed?
Yeah.
And I came up with 3 of these women.
Ooh, I was only thinking of 2. Go, Rob.
Okay, well, the first one, you know, you remember this is a record that in a sense got remade 30 years later, the record with Helen Merrill.
Yes.
And she's a beautiful singer, really sounds just fantastic. And, you know, beautiful arrangements of, I guess I'm Just a Lucky So-and-so and another version of Summertime, like the one Miles Davis had played. So what about Helen Merrill? I guess he knew her a long time. That was someone he certainly wanted to write for.
The backgrounds on those records are fantastic. I mean, you just you have to go back and listen again. I mean, it really is Gil Evans, you know, signature there. I mean, it's really great. And you know, it's one of those situations there again. I'm sure Helen really, really, really wanted to get Gil, you know what I mean? Because Gil, in that sense, was already kind of a legend or had established that kind of thing through doing, you know, the work with Miles and Kenny Burrell and whoever whoever else he had done. And, you know, that's, you know, something that was probably an honor for her. And then for him, you know, I don't really have all of the answers, but he always was looking for an opportunity to be able to do what he wanted to do. And if was going to allow him to do that, then, you know, sometimes he would take that project.
So you're saying essentially, if he agreed to a record that we now have, like a record with Helen Merrill or Don Elliott, it must have been someone he wanted to write for.
Absolutely.
Regardless of the money, you know, up or down, that was a project he wanted to take.
Absolutely.
And there are 3 more. I realize we're going to have to compress time a little bit. We're going to go until about 8:30 Central Time. But
oh yeah, you're right. 20 minutes.
So there are 3 more records that he wrote for other people, which I think are fantastic. And 2 of them are pretty well known. The first one is for a singer who is not well known, Marcy Lutz. And that's a beautiful swinging record. I don't even know if you guys are aware of that one.
I don't have any. I have to default to Miles there. I don't have any info for you.
Well, later tonight, after we all sign off, Noah, go on YouTube and listen to Gil Evans with Marcy Lutz, Cheek to Cheek, and Traveling Light, and Aren't You Glad You're You? And you're going to say, oh, yeah. But, you know, there's one really cute thing Gil does for her, you know.
Thank you, Rob.
She goes, when a meadowlark appears, aren't you glad you got 2 ears? But the second time she sings that, when a meadowlark appears, and then there's this boopy little bass clarinet solo for about 3 bars. And then she comes back and sings, aren't you glad you got 2 ears? So Gil decided that the bass clarinet was the meadowlark. I just love that, you know.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cute. But she's a wonderful singer. I'm sorry that she's not better known. She certainly deserves it.
And I like learning things. I never heard of, you know, you're educating me right now, Rob.
Well, we're all learning stuff tonight. But the other 2 records that Gil wrote for other people are a lot better known. And maybe we can hit these real quick. And you just alluded to one of them, Noah. Guitar Forms, Kenny Burrell with arrangements by Gil Evans. What do you have to say about that record? Do you remember anything?
Miles and I believe weren't quite here yet, or were just arriving at that point, because I think that was early 60s. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think it was more mid, maybe about 65, 66.
But keep in mind, I was born in 64. Miles was born in 65. So you know what I mean.
So you guys were born right around the Guitar Forms time.
Yes, and I think my mom used to have these jokes about like what would come out first. Would it be the baby or the album? You know, those kind of
given the legend of your father's slow, meticulous work, probably the baby.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because at Kenny Burrell, even though we know him in some ways as a very bluesy, swinging electric guitarist, I believe he played acoustic guitar on a lot of that record. Did he not?
That sounds
like
right.
On Moon and Sand and some of those things.
Well, yeah, or semi, you know what I mean? Like basically acoustic, even if it was electric, it wasn't like, you know, Hendrix electric.
No, not yet.
Yeah.
Well, so that's a beautiful record for people to check out. Guitar Forms, Kenny Burrell with Gil Evans, and
Great
then
backgrounds there again. Great backgrounds on that. Great backgrounds.
yes,
Yeah, totally.
gorgeous. And
Yeah,
using the stable of incredible musicians that Gil liked to use, people like Elvin Jones and Richard Davis and Ron Carter and all those incredible horn players from New York, and then finally 1966 you have Look to the Rainbow, which is Astrid Gilberto, who, knock on wood, is still with us. I think Astrid is 80 or maybe 81. Remember, Miles, one time we shared a cab with her leaving Sweet Basil. And I was just in love with her. I'm like, man, I don't care how old she is. I want to keep sitting next to Astrid Gilberto.
I hate that there's always this flack about, I hear some almost disparaging stuff. People saying like, she could barely sing, or she was this, that, the other thing. And that's just so terrible to hear, because what people don't understand is the common theme with all Gil Evans music is that he had feel, and the music had feel. And if you think about it, that's what the Astrid, all the records, but with Astrid, that's what it was. It had feel.
Yeah.
And apparently some of those tunes are like, feminist anthems. You know what I mean? That's a huge album.
Like maybe She's a Karaoke or one of these songs, or
I'll have to. I
well,
wish I was.
I
wish
such
I was
a gorgeous record
prepared.
and voice. I mean,
it is.
When you think about songs like "I Will Wait for You" and "Once Upon a Summertime," and how gorgeous they are, Astrid nails that. You can cry when you listen to "I Will Wait for You." It's just so beautiful.
No,
Once Upon a Summertime, another version of that. You heard it on Quiet Nights, which we didn't talk about,
which is Miles
but
and Gil.
To hear it, but to hear it with Astrucci and Gil Evans like that, so beautiful as well, with yet a different arrangement than what was on Quiet Nights. So,
well, suffice it to say, I totally stand behind Astrid, and that's a fantastic record. I would like to point out, Gil didn't write every arrangement on it. Some of those arrangements are by Al Cohn, but the majority of the arrangements on the record are by Gil. And the ones that are by, and Al Cohn is an incredible arranger, but the ones that are Gil Evans, right away they're Gil Evans, like Barenbow. And so anyway, I would really recommend that record. Look to the Rainbow, Astrid Gilberto and Gil. Fellas, let's jump ahead a little bit. So how about the idea, the working relationship between Miles Davis and Gil Evans? The dynamic of these guys being wonderful friends, very different kinds of people who were perfect puzzle pieces, who seemed to be very loving and interactive and different. And Miles occasionally maybe claimed more credit than he should have for things that Gil wrote. I think that's a fair thing to say. One example would be, I don't think most of our listeners know, when you listen to Kind of Blue, the best-selling jazz record ever made, the piano introduction with bass with Bill Evans and Paul Chambers for So What was not written by Miles Davis. It was written by your dad, Gil Evans.
It was. For people that are not as well versed as you, we had Bill Evans, time remembered the great Bill Evans on piano, and Gil Evans, the great composer and arranger. Just wanted to say that. I know that's obvious for everybody,
for whoever it is
here, but for some people, it's confusing.
Right, but here's the point.
But you're right.
Here's the intro. Point. Nowhere on that record will you ever see the information that introduction was written by Gil Evans. So when you consider it this way, let's leave the horrifying unpaid royalties out of the equation. And let's just realize that the beginning of So What, which millions of people have listened to since 1959, they don't even realize that they're hearing the writing of Gil Evans for a short period of time, right?
That's true.
It's true. You're right. Yeah. And that prelude to So What, or whatever you want to call it, that's a Gil Evans composition.
That's exactly right. And now here's another thing. There occasionally are times where, to be blunt, there's a composition that is credited to Miles Davis, but is not his. It is by Joe Zawinul, or it is by Jackie McLean, and that happened to your dad too. But as I've
by Hermeto Pasquale.
Right. Hold on. But as I've discussed many years ago with your mother, Anita Evans, and with both of you, there seems to be a dynamic between Miles and Gil where, first of all, Miles was more likely to take the credit and Gil was less likely to be upset about having the credit taken. Would you like to address that
Yeah,
dynamic
I mean,
between the two of them?
I would like to address it and to say that Gil was pretty cool about it, and that, you know, I'm not saying that maybe for some of that he wouldn't have minded if Miles had given him the credit, but he was pretty cool about it. And for him, it was about the music. It wasn't about the money. And, you know, it was this thing, this amazing friendship, lifelong friendship of the two of them, and these two incredible innovators coming together to do the most amazing work. And it was beautiful on some levels, because it might not have yielded music as great had that not been there. We don't know, but that is possible.
Well, here's another example, and I'm not trying to stir up some shit with this, but here's something else that Miles had his credit for, and Gil was not mentioned, but it's nice for the world to know what Gil did. On the record Feet of Kilimanjaro, which is probably the last straight ahead record of the Miles Davis Quintet with Herbie and Ron and Tony and Wayne Shorter, there's a song called Frelon Brun, which I believe means, is that Brown Hornet? But we know that that song is really called 11, and it's really composed by Gil Evans. We've been playing that in the Gil Evans band.
Is that Petite Machines?
Oh, maybe I have the wrong title. Yeah.
I think it's Petite Machines, or however they pronounce that.
That could be.
That's accurate.
But anyway, the song 11 by Gil Evans is on Feet of Kilimanjaro, but it is not titled that way, and it's listed as a Miles Davis composition. So I'm not casting any disparagement. I'm just pointing out, hey, that song is a Gil Evans composition.
Yeah, yeah, it is, and it's just beautiful that they played it. And you know, Gil loved Miles so much. He loved Herbie too. Loved, as we said before, Tony Williams and
Wayne Shorter.
Oh, without a doubt. You know, he loved Wayne. The work that they did in the late '60s together that we were talking about the other day, Rob.
Yeah.
So, you know, he loved them, and of course he loved Ron also. I'm not trying to leave Ron Carter out.
And Rob, to your point, his first thought wasn't like, oh wow, well, you know, how can I get credit for this, or
of course
how do I get on a Miles album, and like, you know, me. Gil was just going with, you know what I mean, like
the flow of however he was contributing and interacting with Miles and Herbie and everybody. Well, here's an example.
And his primary focus was just doing the best music he could, and he wasn't really thinking through to the end some of those things you're talking about.
And think about it, that was 20 years after they first met. That was like, you know, 20 years of them being close friends. 20 years after they met, all the amazing work they did, innovating a new style with the Birth of the Cool.
Right, now what about this?
Davis,
40 years.
Innovating again with Sketches of Pain, Porgy and Bess, Miles Ahead, Quiet Nights.
Yeah.
You know, that's a new style there. So all the amazing work that they did before that, and after that, of course, they were going to innovate yet another style of music. So, you know, it's just
I want to mention two things. I want to mention two things about that. A lot of people think that Quiet Nights is really the last evidence of Miles and Gil doing a full collaboration of a record together. Just want to point out that there's a piece from 1968 that is recorded. You can hear it on YouTube, Falling Water, which is this incredible, very different Gil Evans composition featuring Miles Davis. And sometimes people will say, well, that is the last real recorded evidence of Miles and Gil working together. But strangely, in the 1980s, 40 years after they became friends, Gil did get some credit on a record from Miles when he had, you know, this burning kind of modern funk band with Mike Stern and Al Foster and John Schofield on the record Star People. I forget which song it is, but there's a song there where the melody that Miles plays with Bill Evans, the saxophonist, the melody is something that John Schofield had improvised and Gil Evans had written down and codified into a tune. And I wonder if you guys could speak really briefly about Gil's habit of taking people's improvisations and turning them into written music for the whole band.
Yeah, well, it was just interesting because he did both. He did things, as my brother mentioned earlier, where he would compose the solos for people. So he would compose those solos, but also, you're right, he also did the opposite and wrote down people's solos and used them as well. So It was just so amazing that he did both. And I think it was very interesting. And, when you think about Scofield and what an incredible guitarist and musician John Scofield is, so amazing, and just such a beautiful combo to have Mike Stern and John Scofield together on the road and in the band, and just so awesome.
Well, that was a short time with those two guys together. It was a transition.
It's true, it was short.
Stern was on his way out and Scofield was on his way in. But
I know, but it was cool when Miles did have both of them, and when you would hear them on the road, how Stern and Sco played. It was like a different instrument. It was so cool the way Sco just played it. It was like, this was like two different instruments.
Well, speaking of that, fellas, hold on. We got 10 minutes, Miles. I don't mean to cut you off, but since you're on the tip of talking about guitar players, we have to fit in tonight. What do you think happened to Gil Evans when he first heard Jimi Hendrix? Noah?
Let me just backtrack 1 second and then we can get into that. I just wanted to say that to the point that we were discussing before, absolutely every album that Miles did, Gil was a part of in some way, shape, or form, or had influence, or Miles was bouncing ideas off of. So people shouldn't be surprised by that. But to your point, yeah, there's no credits for that.
Okay, so well, the thing is, some Miles Davis records credit Gil and others don't. And let's say maybe not every record, but very many records when Miles was recording, Gil was involved in some way.
That's what I'm trying to say.
And again, regardless of credit or money or royalties, it's just nice for Gil to be acknowledged in that fashion.
And exactly, that's all I'm trying to say. Gil and Miles were inseparable. We have tapes that are part of the archives that can prove that. That'll be another subject.
Well,
go ahead.
And even if Gil wasn't a part of Live Evil, made in 1971, that's one of the very few that he was not a part of. Most he was. So there could have been a few here and there. Since, as Gil loved to say, Miles Davis didn't take a vacation for 30 years. That's why he took that 5.5-year break, because he was working nonstop practically.
Hendrix.
30 years. But anyway.
Okay.
So sorry about that.
No, it's all right. So look, Gil clearly loved the music of Jimi Hendrix. They made that record. It has its flaws. And I think that the Gil arrangements and the band playing Hendrix's music got better later. The music of Jimi Hendrix, to me, is not as great a record as it could have been. But but
think about how long ago it was done, and the fact that Hendrix died. I mean, that was just so heartbreaking that they were going to do that record together.
Well, okay, hold on. Let's backtrack. So we know that Miles's really young wife, Betty Mabry, probably turned him on to Jimi Hendrix. And for all I know, your mother, Anita, is the person who turned Gil on to Jimi Hendrix. But what I want to know is, what do you think happened? Because there was a sea change in Gil's music. There was an addition of a lot of electric instruments, some wailing rock guitar players using the electric bass with Herb Bushler. Gil's music changed a lot when Jimi Hendrix entered his ears and his mind. And can you give a short?
Well, I can give a short answer to that. But what I want to say quickly is that it actually changed before that. The 1969 record, the Ampex record, was where he had Moogs on there and started with the electronics before Hendrix, and Todd Rundgren was the engineer on that.
No kidding.
So that's where it's all started. It's pretty amazing that it started in 69, and even though that record didn't sell the incredible amounts of records that Bitches Brews sold, Gil and Miles at the same time entered into jazz rock fusion, but a very amazing kind of jazz rock fusion that was interesting and not, loaded with any small hints of CD 101.9. There was none of that lame CD 101.
Right. Miles, I got to move it along. I'm going to move it along. I'm going to move it along because there are things we really want to talk about that are more personal with Gil that we don't want to leave out of the interview tonight. So sorry to cut you off, but I hear that's very interesting.
Sorry.
I mean, who the hell knows that Todd Rundgren worked on a Gil Evans record? So
it was his first multi-track recording.
Okay, I want to get into something that we were going to probably get into an hour ago. Let's talk about you guys being family members with the great Gil Evans and having this guy. He's a legend, but he's also just your dad, okay? We talked about how you guys were road rats. I mean, you were kids on tour on the road when other kids in New York might just be going to school or going to the Hamptons or whatever they were doing. You guys were on tour in Europe and Japan, with your dad's band. And how old were you when your parents started referring to you as roadies?
Gil said that we
No,
were born to be
it
roadies,
was 6.
and I'll just
Born
say
to be roadies?
we were born to be roadies. And I'll just say that, we were fortunate because most of the times those tours were the summertime, right? Because my mom was dead set on us being educated and going to school. So she didn't like the idea of us being taken out to go on tour, but in the summer we were able to go. So as I'm sure Miles was going to say, Japan, I think was 1972. We had Europe in 71 and maybe 74 and then 78 and 81 and Japan again in like 83 and 84. And so, we really did have a chance, very blessed to be able to do a lot of.
So you had the hip, living in the West Village, New York City jazz kid life, but you also got to go on the road and be around Billy Harper and Howard Johnson and see the world, and kind of an incredible childhood for both of you, no?
Absolutely. You don't realize it when you're that age, but yes.
Well,
sure.
Okay, so let me ask you guys some personal questions.
The only one we missed was the Far East that had Jeff Berlin on bass in 1976. That was the only one we didn't go on.
Oh, okay.
But
All right.
All the others. Just figured I'd throw that in there.
Okay, I have some more questions about the family. So what if each of you could answer individually for a couple of sentences, what would you say about Gil as a dad? My impression is that he was very loving and he always made time for you guys. But what do you have to say about Gil, Noah?
I agree with that. He was a fantastic dad. And my definition of a fantastic dad is just a dad that is there, is available for you, has time for you, isn't like, get away from me, kid, you're bothering me. Miles and I used to torture Gil with, play Monopoly with us, play poker with us, he was such a sport. He would do all those kind of you could argue like wasting his life kind of things, but he could be writing another like Sketches of Spain. But meanwhile, now he had kids and he had to, be.
But he made the time for you.
And he was older, so in that sense, he was ready. When I was born, Gil was 51 or 2. So,
it was 51.
Yeah, he was ready, and accomplished a lot in his life. I would say, and he was ready to be a dad. He was fantastic in that sense because he was available for us.
Right. And what about you, Miles?
Well, I remember when Gil said that he was so into his work that he wanted to wait until he had some time to have children. And so it was just so amazing that he really did do that. And he was the best dad ever. The best dad in the world. And when I was born, he was 53, and just incredible to have a dad in the world that waited until he was 51 for his first child, 53 for his second, and really had time for us.
Right.
Yet still worked and made us feel great as he was working, etc. It was an unbelievable thing to have a dad like that, but also a dad that vowed that after his father left him and his life, as I said before, was shrouded in mystery, he never knew who his dad was, it really upset him, that he did the opposite. He didn't copy that. He did the opposite, and he was the best dad in the world. So
that's amazing. That's a great turnaround. That's great work, Gil. Beautiful. Well, now let's talk about your beautiful, hilarious, incredibly brilliant mother, Anita. Formerly Anita Cooper, still with us and a little frail, but we love her and she's still here. Anita,
85 last year.
85 last year. Yeah. Well, okay, 2 things I want to ask you about Anita. Nothing real personal. The first one is address the story where Gil was working on the same chord for so many days and so many hours that the famous quote is, Anita said, Gil, you've been sitting there so long, you've got calluses on your ass. Now, Noah, can you respond to that? You're a little older. Do you remember this?
I don't remember this, but that sounds honestly like it's probably a true story.
Well, because the thing that we maybe haven't discussed is Gil, I think, was a notoriously slow worker. And occasionally there might be, I guess Gil didn't function like a normal person with a deadline. And if you said, I want the charts by February 20th, there was no guarantee.
He was a perfectionist. And what I mean by that is he would work and rework things endlessly. And that was why he said that he wrote and did everything in pencil, because you were never finished. You always had that chance to use the eraser and then, kind of update it, whatever it was that you were trying to work on or expand, and that's absolutely how he was.
Okay, well, here's the other question about
Yeah,
Anita.
and now, and Rob, just
Yep.
quickly, now that you mentioned that, it is true, because he admitted to me that he worked so long over the years that he did have those calluses there. So it is true.
Oh, so these are real calluses. It's not just a snarky comment. Well, the other thing about Anita is, there's a song that
Sorry, we don't have any photo evidence.
I have to say this. Two of my very favorite Gil Evans pieces are very upsettingly short on the vinyl records. Here Come the Honey Man on Porgy and Bess, which is like a fade in and out, about 50 seconds. And then the funk magnum opus, Anita's Dance, off of There Comes a Time, which is not really as long as it should have been, but just my opinion, because it's just a little chunk of something that's really cool, but there's like a 15-minute version featuring Lou Soloff and Pete Levin on one of the Live at the Public Theater records. Anita's Dance, what I read was Gil said, I wrote this based on the little dance that Anita would do while she was cooking in the kitchen. Can you guys speak to that?
I don't know anything about that, but I can tell you that we have another version of Anita's Dance coming up on Hidden Treasures Volume 3, which we haven't even done Volume 2, which you're on, Rob.
Right, which hasn't been released yet. All the nice stuff that we did.
Yes, so Volume 2 coming out first, you're on that, and then Volume 3 has Anita's Dance on it, another version.
Beautiful. Well, so now here's another thing. Gil is a person. Now, I think, Miles, you're the one who told me this. Maybe we were in New York, but, when I was kind of like what we're doing, pushing you and prodding you for information about Gil as a person. And somehow you told me that Gil used to have a phrase that he said, famous last words. And what can you guys say? What do you think Gil meant? How was he thinking when he would use that phrase with somebody?
He was always like, basically, don't listen to what people say, just watch for what they do, So if someone says something, that doesn't really mean anything, basically. Just let's see what actually happens.
Right. And well,
exactly. And it was great, though, because what it also was him letting you know that if you're going to brag and boast, that it might turn into famous last words. So if I'm going to brag about that, I feel like I'm 19 and I feel just as good as I did when I'm 19, and I can bench press more than I could then, et cetera, et cetera. I'm eating healthy, whatever, feeling great. Gil would say famous last words. So it's a beautiful thing, because, don't be so full of yourself and don't think that you can't get hit by a truck tomorrow. You know what I'm saying? I just like that. It just was a good thing. And it was not just on that focus. It also focused in on other areas, but just, realize that, you don't want to be overstating things and being too full of yourself, talking too much.
Okay,
careful what you say.
That's interesting, because I had interpreted it differently, and each of you have your own take on it, which both sound really great. I had thought that what he meant by famous last words was more like, don't make plans, they're not going to work out the way you want. Is there an element of that? Like,
well, there's that too.
Okay, next year we're going to tour, and we're going to go to Italy for 4.5 weeks, and then we're going to go to Spain. Famous last words. Like, don't count on it.
So it's really all three. Yeah. It's all three of them are valid. We've all nailed it because it was multi-dimensional.
So Gil would use this phrase in different kinds of situations.
Exactly.
Famous last words. Okay,
right.
Now what about this? What do you think about the fact that Gil had incredible individuals in his band all the time? I mean, it's a little different. Like on Sketches of Spain, nobody necessarily knows who's playing fourth trumpet, or if Eddie Kane is playing second flute,
or if Ernie Royal's playing lead.
Right. Well, that you would know. Ernie
Royal.
Royal.
I know. I'm messing with you now.
But let's put it this way. From the 70s onwards, for the last couple decades of Gil's life, he had these incredible musicians who gravitated to his band, and sometimes for not a lot of bread, who were very loyal. People like David Sanborn, Howard Johnson, Lou Soloff, Pete Levin. Can you speak?
Jocko.
Well, no, but Jocko, that's more of an in and out. But I'm talking about the people who stayed in the band for years and years. A person like Lou Soloff or Pete Levin.
Yeah, Lou Soloff.
People who played in the Gil Evans band in one way or another for 20, 30 plus years. What inspired that loyalty? What would make a person like Lou Soloff make sure that he never missed a Gil Evans gig?
And I hate to say this, Rob, for someone like Pete Levin, we might be in the 50-year category because he
Oh,
started
really?
with, yeah, because he started with the band in the early 70s.
Right.
So think about that. If you do the math, we're coming up on almost 50.
Okay, but what I'm saying is, obviously the music was such a draw that people were not. I mean, yeah, maybe you go to Europe or Japan and make a taste, but if you're going to play at the public theater and maybe everybody,
Or even every Monday night, think about it at Sweet Basil,
the
right?
Sweet Basil.
Miles, what was it, $40
No.
a night
We're not going to talk
originally?
about what the money was.
No, but
No,
dude,
we don't want to.
but
Because
dude, that was, I mean, to get those caliber cats for $40, that's like cab fare. The reason why they were
like
doing
I
But he
said,
also got,
it's
he
not
used
for
to do,
cab
he used
fare.
to sub in the 70s. He used to sub at the Village Vanguard and sometimes do some Monday nights
with
just for
Thad
sure
and Mel.
in the
Right.
70s. And some of those were 20.
Thad Jones
I'm,
and
I
Mel.
don't. I'm telling you, I don't want to talk about the money. I really don't. That's not what I
No,
meant.
but
Okay.
Rob, our point
Sorry.
is that
Yeah.
because it was so little money, they were doing the gig not for the money.
Well, that I'm aware of, but what I'm asking more is somebody like Lou Soloff or Pete Levin, all kinds of musicians, they move around and they play with different bands, and you leave Art Blakey and you leave Miles Davis, but there is a loyalty with a person like Howard Johnson or Lou Soloff. Can you address more specifically, forget about the money, why would a musician like that want to stay with Gil for 30 years and do whatever they could with Gil and never leave and never stop?
It was like
They loved
family for
Gil.
someone like Lou Soloff. I mean,
Sure.
they were family. Lou
Right.
was part of the family, in short.
Well, let's also bring this up. When I met you guys, when I started playing in the band at Sweet Basil in the 90s, basically what I learned is, Miles, you're a trumpet player and you played in and for a while led the band. And Noah, you're a wonderful recording engineer. And when we do Gil Evans music today, you're the person recording and engineering it. And so, Miles, I want to ask you a question. You have expressed that you are one of the only people alive who ever got a private trumpet lesson with Miles Davis. Is that not true?
I would say so. I doubt there's very many more people alive that did. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but it is my guess.
Well, and so the thing is, let's assume that he helped you because he loves Gil and you guys are family. So you're very lucky that happened. And of course, he's your namesake. You are named after Miles Dewey Davis III, right?
That's correct.
Right. So, I mean, and I forget, which of you is older, Noah?
I'm older, yeah. I was going to be named either Noah or Eleanor because my parents, my grandmother, my grandfather on my mother's side was Noah and Eleanor. So I was Guy, so I was named Noah.
Right.
But Miles came out without a name and they were struggling to come up with a name. And Miles was like, name him Miles.
Oh, really?
And, yeah. And then my mom asked her sister, who unfortunately passed away. Sorry, Auntie. She, Anita was like, well, Miles says we should name him Miles. What do you think? And she was like, yeah, name him Miles.
Okay. So your aunt and Miles Davis are responsible for him being named Miles.
Absolutely.
I made an uninformed assumption that it was Gil's idea. Okay.
And I'm sure Gil was in there for
right. Well, so the point is,
it was Miles' idea. Miles.
Well, so can I ask you guys a blunt question that will be of interest to our viewers? Would you guys say that in an informal way, Miles Davis felt like your uncle in the family?
He was our godfather.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes. Technically our godfather. He was
Noah Evans's and Miles Evans's godfather, both of ours. Yes.
Beautiful. Correct. So Miles, the question is, without getting too technical, what did Miles Davis show you when he gave you a private lesson or two?
Well, it was interesting because he talked about, sound innovation, and he talked about taking the parts that you have a hard time with, because you wanted to also get to simpler stuff because he knew I was just a student. Mm-hmm. So the way he would talk about, clapping the rhythm if you needed to, or talk about singing the pitches in perfect rhythm if you needed to, which was interesting because it really, with him and the second trumpet in the New York Philharmonic, Vince Penzarella, both of them stressed that point. It was so powerful because it showed you that a trumpet's not like a piano. you can't just touch it and be in perfect tune. You got to hear that. You've only got 3 valves, and if you're not hearing it, it's probably not going to be in tune or right. So it's just so cool that Miles was talking about that, being able to sing it perfectly, or at least hear it in your mind perfectly, so that you can nail it, because anything can come out of the trumpet. And if you don't have that down, you're not going to be doing interval studies very well, or pieces that have a flat 9th interval, a sharp 13th interval, a flat 5th, a major 7th, whatever. These tough intervals, especially when you have to play them quickly, are going to be next to impossible to nail if you're not hearing that perfectly. That was some very important information, and it's obviously a tough thing to do at times, especially if you're sight reading music. But it's so important for trumpet players to then be able to relax. You can hit it if you're a trumpet player and not do that, but it's just way better if you can and are, because then you're going to be relaxed and you're going to enjoy playing the music. You know what I mean?
Well, that's really interesting to hear. That's great. Fellas, I have just a couple more little areas before we sign off. We talked about the fact that Gil had this penchant for redoing some of his older pieces for new bands and new soloists. And, one example I had, if you can, maybe give me like a little short bit of information. King Porter Stomp featuring Cannonball Adderley in whatever it was, let's say 1959. And then I listened to it this morning, with tuba and Moog synthesizers and all of that, and congas playing essentially the same vibe of a chart featuring David Sanborn in the 70s. And when you think about how different Cannonball and Sanborn are stylistically and sonically, it's really amazingly prescient of Gil Evans to think, I could use that song for both of these cats.
That's Gil.
And 1959 to 1973 is only 14 years, but musically and in American culture, that felt like about 50 years. So I think it's really amazing that Gil would say, well, here's some Jelly Roll Morton music that's perfect to feature Cannonball, and here's some Jelly Roll Morton music, which I can still use under David Sanborn. And it works tremendously well. And to me, that's sort of like, if you think of Gil as a warlock and a dude who could create some magic with a bubbling cauldron, basically thinking, well, nobody would ever put cinnamon or dill in this stew, but I know it's going to work. Does that make any sense? And here's another example. That beautiful ballad by John Benson Brooks, who was a New York City composer, Where Flamingos Fly. You've got Jimmy Knepper playing trombone on it on Out of the Cool, and then later you got Helen Merrill singing it, and then you also later have Billy Harper playing it in the 70s. Basically the same arrangement, but it's not just saying, let me feature trombone on this, and whoever's playing trombone this year will, to say, I'm going to use this arrangement for Jimmy Knepper or for Billy Harper or for Helen Merrill, these incredible individuals on different instruments. What do you think it was about Gil where he thought, I can take that old arrangement and remake it for this person and it'll work beautifully?
That's Gil. He just knew, he did.
And Owen, what about this one? What do you think about Summertime?
Just quickly.
Sorry, Miles.
I just want to say quickly, and it comes right back to his brilliance in terms of taking these different instrumentations and using them on the same song, but just in incredible ways. So that was part of it. Again, with all the other things, whether it was electronics and other amazing things that just really added so many different things. So many different flavors thrown in there, and it just was brilliance. I mean,
so in a way, but it's kind of like what I said. It's like saying, well, I'm going to make that salmon dish again, but this time I'm going to make a different sauce or something like that. I mean, to me, Gil was like a chef, a very arduously working, slow, minute, careful chef. What about this one? Summertime, Miles Davis on Porgy and Bess, version everybody knows. Helen Merrill singing it with essentially the same backgrounds. And then in the 70s, John Abercrombie was a really close friend of mine, a great guitar player. We really miss him too. And I used to talk to John about Gil. I don't know if you guys knew about that. And I would say, John, I forgot you were in Gil's band in the 70s. Tell me. And John told me a couple things maybe you guys don't even know. John lived in Chelsea, like West 18th Street, and he had a big loft. And he told me that for some reason, Gil couldn't practice piano at home. So Gil would always come over to John's house and, sit at the piano for a bunch of hours. And John's like, gee, I'm home in my living room listening to Gil Evans, shed and write music.
The neighbors complained.
The neighbors in your building.
Horrible neighbors.
Oh, in West Beth.
That's what it was.
But Abercrombie told me something interesting about Summertime. I guess, like any other great band leader, like Buddy Rich or Woody Herman, there's some people who just don't click with the band leader, and there are other people who become their great friends and their confidants or drinking buddies, or, I can't imagine Lou Soloff not being a great friend of your dad's, and Howard Johnson and other people who were there forever. Well, what I'm getting at is Abercrombie said that when he was hanging out alone with Gil, I'm going to be very careful how I phrase this. Do you remember that quote where Gil would say, "Screw these male chauvinist horn players"? When he felt, when Gil wasn't regulating the length of solos, that some of the cats in the band were soloing for a very long time. And what Abercrombie told me was Gil wouldn't tell them to solo less, but what he would do was say to John, "Summertime is yours. When we play Summertime, you jump in. That's your solo. Screw those horn players." And he was talking about his own, sidemen, his own employees, which I think is really pretty funny. But then you've got John being featured on electric guitar on an arrangement that used to be for Miles Davis or Helen Merrill. It's pretty interesting, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no. Amazing. And what a brilliant musician John Abercrombie was.
Yeah,
Have
no
him
doubt.
play it.
Well,
come on.
You know what? To me, John is just another amazing individual who found his way to Gil Evans because he belonged there. Like Howard Johnson and Billy Harper and George Adams and David Sanborn and all those folks. I have one more thing. We seem to have lost you, Noah. Noah, are you there?
I thought he was going to come right back. Maybe he just paused us for a second.
I don't know. But I really just had one more question before we signed off. There he is. Noah, we're losing you.
He is. He's going to come right back.
Yeah.
My connection. Sorry, gentlemen.
Yeah, that's all right. We got you back. Well, we're almost done here. We just had one more little thing to say. Noah, when you and I were talking about Gil the other night, you really said something. Remember, I stopped you and said, "Man, that's really profound." And you just sort of skipped over it because you were just expressing yourself talking about Gil. You basically said that Gil Evans didn't just improvise music and composition, he improvised a life. He didn't go into the army when other people did. He didn't get married when he was supposed to. He didn't go to college when he was supposed to. He married an African-American woman. He turned down, we got to talk about that before we go, about Barry Manilow. But the point is, what you told me was that basically in the time frames that Gil was living in, he never lived a traditional life demanded of him by society or other people. He lived life his own way. And you said Gil Evans improvised his own life. What do you think of that?
That's absolutely right. The norms that you would associate with, what you're supposed to do as whether you're an American or just in life in general, whatever culture you grew up in, that didn't really apply to Gil. Gil more just followed what, he went by feel, which is kind of, to me, that's what improvising is. You kind of like go by feel. You're not listening to what other people are telling you should do, and you're not following some previously created roadmap or list of norms that are supposed to happen. And Gil didn't live his life that way. Gil lived his life, every moment was anything could happen.
Right. Well, that's beautiful. And also, Miles, you taught me the other night, we talked about all the commercial projects that Gil turned down, various film scores, various pop and rock musicians. And what you taught me the other day, Miles, was that Gil actually did say yes to working with David Bowie and Elvis Costello. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, well, it was
beginners.
Interesting that he
Absolute beginners.
Absolute beginners, yeah. And I think that was an awesome thing to say yes to. And it was interesting.
Was it
even if some people consider it a box office failure, I think it was interesting
It was a movie, not a record, correct?
Julian Temple.
Yeah,
movie.
yeah, and you know, it's considered sometimes people get it that it didn't do as well at the box office as some people would like. You know what? It was amazing, and you know, for him to just really inspire David Bowie and to be working with Elvis Costello on it with him on it as well. It just was interesting. And then, of course, working with Sting after that. So it's just amazing that Gil at 75, 74, 75, 73, these last years that he worked with David Bowie, Sting, and Elvis Costello. So it just, again, goes back to what you were talking about when you said that Gil was an omnivore. And he really was. I mean, imagine Johnny Mathis, Charlie Parker. He almost did a record with Louis Armstrong, had a nice meeting with Louis once many, many, many years ago. All these people, I mean, just this ridiculous number of people.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine Jimi Hendrix playing with Marcy Lutz? I mean, it's like the broadest range in the world. And well, speaking of that, so very quickly then, I checked out Absolute Beginners, and I found a couple of pieces that were strictly like Gil Evans big band pieces. One of them is called Va Va Voom. Other pieces, it was harder for me to tell what Gil's contribution was, and I wasn't able to find anything with Elvis Costello, but that was from the same movie?
Yeah, Elvis was there working with them. Even if you couldn't find anything from Elvis, David Bowie brought Elvis Costello in. And, my father did teach them about standards and about just different voicings and voice leading and counterpoint lines. So it was just an amazing lesson for them to have Gil Evans there. You know what I mean?
Sure. Well, and so maybe we'll close with this, fellas. Who wants to tell the story about Gil being offered the chance to write 2 charts for Barry Manilow?
Go ahead, Miles.
Well, it was interesting because there was one call where I picked up the phone and I heard, what I heard was Barry announcing who he was, and then them talking and Barry saying to Gil, hey, I just want you to do a couple of arrangements and I'll pay you $100,000. And that was back, $100,000 was worth $1 million in today's money.
What year do you think this was?
This was approximately 1975.
Oh, this is when Barry, and you know what? That's when Barry had a #1 hit, Mandy, that was #1 for about 7 weeks.
Totally. So he was huge.
Barry Manilow at the top of his career. Totally. So he's essentially saying to Gil, I'll give you $50,000 a chart, write me 2 charts, please. Right?
He was huger than huge. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just unbelievable. And Gil just couldn't bring himself to do it because Gil didn't think highly of that music. He just couldn't help it. Just for him, it was nothing, and he just couldn't bring himself to do it.
To the eternal disgust of his wife, I guess, right? I guess it didn't go over well with Anita, given how much money that could have been. But you know what? But I didn't bring this story up, again, to stir up some stuff. I brought it up because, sure, he decided I will work with Astrid Gilberto, or I will work with Sting, or I will work with Jaco, or Bowie, or Elvis Costello. I mean, look, this is a guy.
Robbie Robertson from the band.
That's right.
Robbie Robertson from the band.
Gil Evans is a guy who changed his whole repertoire after he heard the music of Jimi Hendrix. He played Stone Free and Little Wing and other pieces that we still play, but for the rest of his life.
Yeah, Castles Made of Sand.
Castle, yeah. So, but the point being that he was open to pop music, but apparently not open to Barry Manilow.
And there were so many times where he would get calls for stuff that paid a lot. He'd be like, I know this arranger named Quincy Jones. He's really good. You should use him.
Is that what Gil would say?
That's what he did say. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what he did say.
Yeah.
More than once.
Anita again wasn't too thrilled, but somewhere right there when we were very young people, Miles and I, Gil did turn down some stuff that ended up going to Quincy. Yeah.
Do you remember just very specifically any projects or artists that he turned down aside from Barry?
Here's where I wish Anita was still alive. She would know better probably than Miles and I, but maybe Miles has a few.
Yeah, she would know. I just remember one movie score that was back in the 70s. It was going to be Miles Davis and Gil Evans, and they offered Gil 50,000, which really in today's money is 500,000, and he said no.
Yeah. Well, you know, I just want to bring up Sting really quickly. I mean, we keep on staying here, but hopefully we have some listeners and viewers who are interested. And one thing we forgot to mention is there is a virtual Venmo tip cup here, but rest assured that the three of us will split any donations if anybody is enjoying what they're hearing and would like to make a donation, because all musicians are currently out of work due to a little pesky virus. No live shows at all. But regarding Sting, there's an incredible record. It's not that easy to get, but it's basically Sting with the Gil Evans Orchestra from Perugia and maybe Umbria in, I believe, 1987 in Italy. And that record has Sting singing some of his own songs like Tea in the Sahara, Consider Me Gone, but he's also singing Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday, you know, the song about lynchings in southern United States that Billie sang. And
they did There Comes a Time, the Tony Williams tune.
Oh, that's right.
There's about 3 different records of that. And remember this, they're all bootlegs. So
right.
it was a concert that we did in a 55,000 seat soccer stadium that was totally packed.
Was that Perugia?
Yep,
for the Umbria Jazz Festival in the summer of 1987. And for that, and from that, there's 3 records, but they're all bootlegs. So just figured I'd say that. But
what I'd like to point out is, you know,
anyway,
you know how I am a self-styled lover and fan of Gil Evans and his music, and that's part of why we're here. You know, why I wanted the universe to hear the story from you two fellas, from his family. And I'm still learning shit about Gil Evans this week, and this is what I learned. I know that he worked with Sting. I saw a thing on YouTube. Oh, Sting with the Gil Evans band, Message in a Bottle. No, it's just Sting playing solo and the band is off stage, and then they probably came out later. But what I discovered this week that I never knew about, because they're not on any records, is I heard the Gil Evans band play Murder by Numbers with Sting singing, which if anybody is really hip, it was a single, but it was the song that was left off of the vinyl album of Synchronicity when it first came out. I remember, man, I was a little kid in college in the 80s. And so Murder by Numbers is a great song, but so there's Gil Evans. Well, I will work with this singer. I will arrange Murder by Numbers. And then the YouTube I called up that said Murder by Numbers, I was excited because I love that song. I wanted to hear what Sting and Gil did on it. And it was mislabeled. It was the wrong song, and it was Synchronicity 1.
Oh, wow.
I know you know me, Synchronicity. And it was the band with Chris Hunter and, you know, and Howard, everybody playing Synchronicity.
We did.
So if people are not hip, Gil Evans wrote amazing arrangements of music, not just by Sting himself, but by the Police. And to me, that was another conscious choice of Gil saying, here's some pop music I dig. You know, and this is something I'm going to do. Oh, and you know, we're going a long time.
You know, we did do Murder by Number. We did do Murder by Number.
Yeah,
by numbers.
We did do it.
Yeah, and also
labeled incorrect.
And also keep in mind, Sting did come down on several Monday nights to play with the band. So.
Oh, at Sweet Basil in the Village in New York. Yes. Okay. Well, that's beautiful. Well, you know,
that was a factor, believe it or not.
Sting is a real exceptional musician in the pop world. He's really one of the better cats, I think. You know. Great singer, great songwriter, great bass player.
Yeah, him to want to do a song in 15/8 called "There Comes a Time" with all those weird chord changes and hard intervals and stuff. It's very impressive.
Well, let's talk about one last thing while we're here
with George Adams.
Right. Well, the last thing I want to mention, because it's a really amazing collaboration that isn't really well documented. It's not on records, although it is on YouTube and video. Can you guys talk about Jaco Pastorius working with Gil Evans?
Go ahead, Miles.
Yeah, well, Jaco loved Gil, and Jaco, you know, tried so hard to get into the band, and Gil already had a bass player.
Yeah, he probably had Mark Egan or somebody else, right?
Yeah, but eventually Jaco got his wish and got to play with the band, and We played with Jack. I remember one night at 7th Avenue South, we had Daryl Jones on bass playing the bass parts. And Jocko came with this incredible rig to solo his ass off with his killer, foot pedals and stuff to play those amazing things that he would play by recording himself playing and soloing over himself and all that.
Yeah.
And he brought that rig to 7th Avenue South. That was a really amazing concert that night with Jocko and Daryl Jones, the bass player from the Rolling Stones.
Well, there is a video.
Blast.
There's a video on YouTube you can find easily of Jaco Pastorius live under the sky in Japan with the Gil Evans Orchestra, where Jaco is essentially the soloist out front with no shirt on, covered in mud, and that's a whole other story. You basically just said to me,
but now that you mention that was in 1984. That was with Herbie Hancock's Rocket Band, Black Uhuru, and the Gil Evans Orchestra featuring Jaco Pastorius.
Unbelievable.
It was called Select Live Under the Sky, done in the beautiful outdoors, amazing concerts. You're right. We opened Open Theater East in Tokyo. It was about an hour from Tokyo, but considered Tokyo. And Jaco came a half hour early playing wild stuff with the war paint on and all that. But that was an amazing thing. And Jaco was the #1 musician in Japan. In 1984, Jaco was bigger than Michael Jackson in Japan. He was the #1 musician there.
Well, he plays better bass than Michael Jackson. It makes sense to me. That's really incredible. But to me, Jaco is like Jimi Hendrix, like Wayne Shorter, like Elvin Jones. It doesn't matter how powerful the music personality was. Gil could handle that. He could handle Elvin Jones. He could handle Jaco Pastorius. And I think those are the people that he gravitated to,
Yes.
Great musicians expressing things. And the final story, if we may, we're going to end on the hour here, is, I only got to play with your dad once. I've had the fortune to play with you guys in the Gil Evans Orchestra, mostly in New York, since, I hate to say it, but, in the early 90s at Sweet Basil. Miles, thank you for inviting me to do that the first time when we were working together with Bob Moses,
You're very welcome.
And you made me bring the sopranino saxophone on the first night. I was subbing for Chris Hunter.
It was great. And one of those nights, just gonna say it fast. One of those nights, Hiram Bullock said, "Hey, Rob Scheps stole my shit," because you took that sopranino and you went through the whole Sweet Basil audience, and that's what Hiram used to do with his wireless guitar.
You mean we're running around the club?
Yeah. So you took that sopranino and you stole Hiram Bullock's stuff.
Well, you may, I don't know if you remember this, but I'm 6'6" roughly, and Lou Soloff was a relatively short guy, like 5'5", 5'6". And I guess one week at Sweet Basil on the Monday, I had stood up on my chair and played a tenor solo. And if I'm standing on a chair at my height, I look like I'm 8 feet tall. I guess it must look pretty crazy. How do I know? I'm just in it. And anyway, the next week, I was just sitting in the section being a more normal person, and Lou was behind me playing trumpet. He kept on yelling at me, "Get on the chair! Get up on the chair! Get on the chair!" And the other thing is, I have to tell you, you guys are so lucky that Anita is still here on the planet, your beautiful 85-year-old mother. And I lost my mother a couple of years ago, and it's awful. I really loved her. Esther, she came to Sweet Basil once to hear us with the Gil Evans Band. And you remember that at that time, Hiram wasn't in the band. He would just come by when he felt like it. Exactly. He was like a major guest soloist. And if Hiram showed up, it's kind of like the parting of the Red Sea. Everybody makes room for Hiram, right?
Exactly.
And if you don't know out there, Hiram Bullock is an African-American guitarist, singer, rock musician, jazz musician, used to get paid triple scale on sessions in New York, and is the guy that David Letterman used to say, "Ladies and gentlemen, on national television with no shoes on, Hiram Bullock," in the first, band with Will Lee and Paul Schaefer and Steve Jordan. And so anyway, I knew Hiram was going to be really loud. I knew he was going to be wearing big, stinky, high-top sneakers with no socks. And I knew that he was going to be right there in front of the band, and it was going to be like, like the old MTV commercial, like your ears getting blown back. And my mom had come into New York City, and she was sitting at the front table in Sweet Basil, right in front of me and Chris Hunter and Alex Foster and Hiram. And I said, "Mom, I really think you should move to the back of the club because this is going to be really loud." And I'll never forget, regarding sitting there to hear Hiram Bullock blasting her ears off, my mother just said, that's okay, dear. I'm fine right here. And she sat there and took it from Hiram for a set. So, my mom is different than yours, but she was also able to hang. Fellas, thank you. It's amazing to talk about Gil Evans here on the week of his 108th birthday with his sons, Miles Evans in the upper left corner, trumpet player, raconteur, Casanova, all the chicks, and in the lower quadrant there, beautiful Noah Evans, more of a peaceful, in the middle of the road sage than his brother, and an incredible recording engineer out in Mill Valley, California. Miles and Noah Evans, the sons.
He's a producer. He's also the music producer of our latest album. Did a great job.
That's right.
Thank you. Did a great job.
Just really quickly, if you want to hear the newest Gil Evans music that we recorded, just look for Sunken Treasures Volumes 1 through 3. Volume 1 is already available. And long story short, I hope we did Gil Evans proud tonight, celebrating his life and legacy and incredible music and his incredible family, you two. So you guys, thank you for being on Live Jazz KC. And thank you to our producer, Herschel McWilliams, and our occasional sound man, Jim Lauer. And just really quickly, I'll be here interviewing Mr. Bobby Watson, alto saxophonist supreme, on Tuesday, May 19th. Nice. Always the same time, 7 p.m. Central. Bobby Watson on May 19th, and the incredible drummer, Bill Goodwin, who was with Phil Woods for 40 years, on May 24th. And in the pipeline after that, Mark Egan, Glenn Moore, nice. Sheila Jordan, and Roger Rosenberg, the jazz grandmother. Nice. All of them. Nice. We're lucky enough, they're all going to be here on the show. So thank you to Live Jazz Kansas City, and thank you so much, Miles and Noah. And I hope everybody out in our audience had a good time hearing about Gil Evans from, in a sense, the horse's mouth from his family.
Thanks very much, Rob and Herschel again, and Miles. Thank you, you guys.
Thank you guys too. Miles and Noah, beautiful. Love you guys, and thank you very much, and happy birthday, Gil Evans.
Happy birthday, Gil. Thank you.
We love you too, bro.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay, Cass. Be in touch.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.